The crystal champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Sterling Grand Ballroom, with a sound that seemed to echo through my soul. 300 of the city's most powerful business leaders turned to stare at the clumsy server in the ill-fitting black dress, their expressions ranging from mild amusement to aristocratic disdain. My mother, Patricia Sterling, shot me a look of pure venom from across the room, her perfectly sculpted features twisted with the kind of embarrassment that comes from being associated with public incompetence. "Mary, for God's sake!" she hissed as she glided over in her designer gown that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Can't you do anything right? This is Sterling Enterprises' most important charity event of the year, and you're making us look like we can't even train our staff properly." The irony was exquisite. I wasn't staff. I was Patricia and Richard Sterling's 28-year-old daughter, serving drinks at my own family's company Gala, because they had decided that my twin brother Marcus deserved to mingle with investors and clients while I earned my keep through manual labor. "At least you're good for something," Patricia had said, when assigning me to catering duty that morning, her voice carrying decades of accumulated disappointment in the daughter who had failed to live up to the Sterling name. I bent to clean up the glass fragments, my face burning with humiliation, as conversations resumed around me with the casual cruelty of people discussing livestock in front of the animals. These were titans of industry, philanthropists whose donations funded hospitals and universities, society figures whose approval could launch careers or destroy reputations, and they were watching Richard Sterling's daughter crawl on the floor like hired help. "The Sterling family certainly believes in hands-on involvement," I heard someone whisper behind me, followed by the kind of polite laughter that cuts deeper than honest ridicule. Marcus chose that moment to make his grand entrance, resplendent in his custom-tailored tuxedo and radiating the effortless confidence that came from a lifetime of unqualified support and unlimited resources. At 28, he looked like corporate royalty, tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of commanding presence that made people assume he must be important, because he carried himself like someone who had never been told he wasn't. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice boomed across the ballroom as he raised his glass in a toast, "I'd like you to meet my son Marcus, the future of Sterling Enterprises. This young man has already revolutionized our luxury retail division, and is preparing to take on greater leadership responsibilities as we expand into international markets." The applause was enthusiastic and genuine, the crowd recognizing Marcus as the heir to a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I watched from my position near the catering station as my brother basked in adulation that I had never once received, his smile bright with the knowledge that everything he surveyed would someday be his. That's when Chairman William Hayes entered the ballroom. Hayes was a legend in the business world, the man who had built Hayes Industries from a single manufacturing plant into a global conglomerate, whose investment decisions could make or break companies, whose approval was sought by everyone from small-town entrepreneurs to Fortune 500 CEOs. His presence at our charity gala was considered a major coup, the kind of endorsement that could elevate Sterling Enterprises to new levels of prestige and profitability. "Richard," Hayes called out as he approached our family, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention from powerful people. "So good to see you again, and this must be the famous Marcus I've heard so much about." Marcus stepped forward with practiced charm, extending his hand with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to stand as an equal among titans of industry. "Mr. Hayes, it's an honor to meet you. I've followed your career for years. Your expansion into renewable energy markets has been particularly impressive." Hayes smiled politely, but briefly, his attention already shifting away from Marcus in a way that seemed to puzzle my brother. Instead, the chairman's eyes scanned the room until they found me, still standing beside the catering station with glass fragments at my feet and shame burning in my cheeks. "Ah, there she is," Hayes said, his face lighting up with genuine warmth as he began walking directly toward me. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as 300 people tried to understand why one of the most powerful men in America was approaching the clumsy caterer with such obvious purpose. "Mary Sterling," Hayes announced, his voice projecting across the silent ballroom. "Majority shareholder of Sterling Enterprises and one of the most astute investors I've ever had the pleasure of working with." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Every face in the room was frozen in expressions of confusion, shock, and dawning realization that the servant they had been ignoring was actually the most powerful person in the building. Patricia's champagne glass joined mine on the marble floor, crystal exploding like the sound of a family dynasty shattering into a million pieces. My earliest memory was of being 5 years old, standing on a kitchen stool to wash dishes while Marcus played video games in the living room, the sound of his laughter mixing with my parents' proud commentary about his natural leadership abilities and exceptional problem-solving skills. Even then, the division of labor in the Sterling household was absolute. Marcus was destined for greatness, while I was destined to make his greatness possible through my silent, invisible support. "Mary's such a helpful child," Patricia would tell her friends when they visited for afternoon tea, gesturing toward me as I served cookies and refilled teapots with the mechanical precision of someone trained from infancy to anticipate others' needs. "She just naturally gravitates toward taking care of people. It's really quite sweet." Sweet, the word that would define my entire childhood, always delivered with the kind of patronizing affection reserved for well-trained pets. Mary was sweet. Mary was helpful. Mary was good at taking care of details that more important people shouldn't have to worry about. Never Mary was intelligent, or creative, or capable of anything that might compete with Marcus's designated role as the family genius. The pattern had been established before I was old enough to question it. Marcus got tutors, I got chores. Marcus got piano lessons. I got responsibility for keeping his practice schedule organized. Marcus got expensive summer camps that built leadership skills and elite social connections. I got the job of packing his suitcase and making sure he had everything he needed for success. "Twins are so interesting," family friends would observe, comparing Marcus and me as if we were some kind of social science experiment. Same genes, same environment, but such different personalities. Marcus is obviously the ambitious one, while Mary seems content with simpler things. The assumption that I was content with my assigned role was based on the fact that I never complained, never demanded equal treatment, never threw tantrums or rebelled against the fundamental unfairness of our family's distribution of resources and attention. What they interpreted as contentment was actually learned helplessness, the survival strategy of a child who had discovered early that resistance only led to more explicit statements about why she deserved less than her brother. School had offered brief respites from the family hierarchy, moments when teachers would praise my work, or classmates would seek my help with difficult assignments. But those external validations were always minimized when filtered through the Sterling family lens. Mary got an A+ on her science project, I might announce at dinner, desperate for some recognition of my academic abilities. "That's nice, sweetheart," Richard would respond absently, then immediately pivot to Marcus. "Tell us about your presentation to the student council. Did they approve your budget proposal for the new computer lab?" The message was clear. Mary's individual achievements were footnotes, while Marcus's leadership activities were headline news, worthy of detailed family discussion and strategic planning for how to leverage them into future opportunities. By high school, I had internalized the family narrative so completely that I barely noticed when guidance counselors asked about my college plans. The assumption was that Marcus would attend an elite university where he could build the connections and credentials needed to eventually take over Sterling Enterprises, while I would choose something practical and local that wouldn't interfere with my primary role as family support staff. "Community college is perfectly respectable," Patricia had said when I brought home information about various university programs, her tone suggesting it was anything but respectable. "You don't want to overwhelm yourself with academic pressure when you have so many family responsibilities." The family responsibilities included managing Marcus's college application process, scheduling his interviews, proofreading his essays, and essentially serving as his unpaid personal assistant while he focused on the bigger picture activities that would secure his admission to Harvard Business School. Even as adults, the pattern had continued with ruthless consistency. Marcus lived in the penthouse apartment that our parents had bought as an investment property, but which functioned as his personal residence. I lived in the basement apartment of the family home, paying below-market rent in exchange for managing household maintenance, coordinating Patricia's social calendar, and serving as the family's all-purpose problem solver. "Mary, so practical," became Patricia's standard explanation for why her daughter was still single, still working in administrative roles, still living like a teenager despite being nearly 30 years old. "She's just not interested in the complications of romantic relationships or career ambitions. She likes her simple life." The truth was more devastating. I had never been given permission to want more than I was offered, never been encouraged to believe I deserved the kind of life that Marcus took for granted, never been treated as someone whose dreams and ambitions mattered enough to support or even acknowledge. until grandmother Eleanor died and left me a legacy that would change everything. Marcus had been born 7 minutes before me, a detail that Patricia never failed to mention when explaining why he was destined to inherit Sterling Enterprises, while I was destined to support his inheritance. The eldest child has certain responsibilities, she would say with the gravity of someone discussing ancient laws of primogeniture, as if 7 minutes of seniority had somehow imbued Marcus with leadership genes that I lacked. From infancy, Marcus had been treated like visiting royalty in our own home. His nursery was a masterpiece of interior design, with custom furniture and educational toys that cost more than most families spent on cars. My space was an afterthought, a corner of the room that had been carved out with practical efficiency rather than aesthetic consideration, furnished with hand-me-downs and discount store necessities. The disparity had only intensified as we grew older. Marcus's bedroom suite occupied the entire east wing of our family's estate, complete with his own sitting area, walk-in closet, and private bathroom with a marble jacuzzi that he used maybe twice a year. My bedroom was a converted guest room on the 3rd floor, functional but forgettable, the kind of space that suggested temporary residence rather than permanent belonging. Marcus needs space to think and create, Richard would explain, when business associates visited and remarked on the obvious difference in how his children were housed. Future leaders require environments that nurture their potential. The nurturing had been comprehensive and expensive. While I attended public school and rode the bus, Marcus was enrolled in Whitmore Academy, an exclusive private institution where tuition cost more than most people's annual salaries. While I did homework at the kitchen table, Marcus had a private tutor who came to the house 3 evenings a week to ensure his academic excellence. The results had been exactly what our parents had hoped for. Marcus graduated valedictorian, student body president, and captain of both the debate team and varsity tennis squad. His college applications read like a resume for someone destined to rule the world, backed by letters of recommendation from teachers who genuinely believed they were launching the career of a future Fortune 500 CEO. Harvard Business School had been the inevitable next step, followed by a strategic internship at Goldman Sachs that Richard had secured through his network of business contacts. By the time Marcus returned to Sterling Enterprises as a junior executive, he had accumulated the kind of credentials that made his rapid promotion seem like merit-based advancement rather than nepotism. Marcus brings fresh perspectives from the outside world, Richard would tell the board of directors when they questioned the wisdom of appointing a 26-year-old to oversee the company's luxury retail division. His Harvard training and Wall Street experience give him insights that traditional family business operations often lack. The board had been skeptical, but ultimately deferential, recognizing that challenging Richard's succession plans would be futile and potentially damaging to their own positions within the company. Marcus was anointed as heir apparent, his office suite designed to communicate authority and sophistication, his business cards featuring titles that grew more impressive with each quarterly review. What the board didn't see, what no one in our family seemed to notice, was how Marcus's revolutionary innovations in the luxury retail division were actually borrowed ideas from case studies he had studied at Harvard, implemented with the kind of flashy presentation style that impressed people who confused style with substance. His celebrated expansion into international markets was based on partnerships that other companies had already established, repackaged with marketing language that made them sound like groundbreaking strategic initiatives. His streamlining of manufacturing operations was actually a cost-cutting program that reduced quality while maintaining prices, generating short-term profit increases that would likely damage the brand's reputation in the long term. But Marcus presented these borrowed strategies with such confidence, such polished professionalism, that Richard and the board treated him like a visionary leader, rather than a talented performer who had mastered the art of making other people's ideas sound like his own innovations. "He's a natural," Patricia would brag to her society friends, displaying Marcus's business school diploma and professional awards like trophies in a display case. "Some people are just born to lead." The natural leader spent most of his time in client meetings that were really expensive lunches, strategic planning sessions that were really networking opportunities, and leadership development activities that were really excuses to travel to conferences in luxury resorts. His actual understanding of Sterling Enterprises' operations was superficial at best, based on quarterly reports and executive summaries, rather than the kind of detailed knowledge that comes from understanding how businesses actually function day to day. While Marcus collected accolades for his strategic vision, I had been learning the company from the ground up, not through Harvard case studies or Goldman Sachs training programs, but through the patient, invisible work of understanding every department, every process, every relationship that kept Sterling Enterprises profitable. The golden twin was about to discover that gold can be very brittle when exposed to real pressure. Grandmother Eleanor Sterling had been the only person in my family who seemed to see me as more than a supporting character in Marcus's starring role. While my parents dismissed my capabilities, and my brother remained obliviously absorbed in his own success, Eleanor would corner me during family gatherings with the kind of intense attention that made me feel like I mattered. "You have your great-grandfather's eyes," she would tell me, studying my face with the focused interest of someone reading important documents. Henry Sterling built this company because he understood that real strength comes from patience and careful observation, not from making noise and demanding attention. At the time, I had thought she was simply being kind to the overlooked granddaughter, offering comfort to balance out the obvious favoritism that Marcus received from everyone else. Eleanor attended all his school plays and sporting events, contributed generously to his private school fundraisers, and displayed his academic awards prominently in her downtown penthouse apartment. But she also insisted on private conversations with me during family visits, conversations that felt different from the polite small talk that characterized most family interactions. Eleanor would ask detailed questions about my school projects, my thoughts on books I was reading, my observations about people and situations that other adults never seemed to think I was capable of analyzing. "What do you think about your brother's plan to expand the tennis program at Whitmore Academy?" she had asked during one memorable Christmas dinner when I was 16, while Marcus held court in the living room, describing his campaign for student body president. "It's smart politics," I had replied without thinking. "The tennis program serves the wealthy families who make the largest donations to the school. Supporting something they care about builds alliances that will help him win the election, even though most students will never benefit from better tennis facilities." Eleanor had smiled with what looked like genuine pride. "Exactly. You see the strategy behind the presentation. That's a rare gift, Mary." The comment had confused me at the time because no one else in my family seemed to consider strategic thinking a gift when it came from me. My insights were dismissed as cynical observations, my analysis was characterized as pessimistic negativity, and my ability to see through social performances was treated as a character flaw rather than a valuable skill. "Mary's always been a little too serious," Patricia would say, when Eleanor praised my intellectual curiosity. "She doesn't have Marcus's natural optimism and enthusiasm for life." But Eleanor had continued to seek out my perspectives, particularly on business matters that seemed far too sophisticated for a teenager to understand. She would describe challenges facing various companies in her investment portfolio, then ask what I thought the underlying problems might be and how they could be addressed. "Sterling Enterprises is facing increased competition in the luxury goods market," she had mentioned during my senior year of high school. "Sales are still strong, but profit margins are shrinking. What would you do if you were responsible for addressing that challenge?" I had spent weeks researching luxury market trends, analyzing competitor strategies, and developing a comprehensive response that addressed everything from supply chain optimization to brand positioning. When I presented my analysis to Eleanor, she had listened with the kind of serious attention usually reserved for professional consultants. "This is graduate-level strategic thinking," she had said, reviewing my written report with obvious admiration. "You've identified problems that your father's management team hasn't even recognized yet, and your solutions are more sophisticated than anything I've seen from Marcus's Harvard case studies." The validation had been intoxicating, the first time in my life that someone had suggested I might be capable of high-level business analysis, rather than just reliable execution of other people's decisions. But Eleanor had also sworn me to secrecy about our conversations, insisting that strategic planning discussions should remain private until the appropriate time for implementation. "Your parents love you both," she had explained, "but they've made some assumptions about your respective capabilities that may not serve the family business interests in the long term. Sometimes wisdom requires patience." I had interpreted her words as gentle criticism of my parents' favoritism, a diplomatic way of acknowledging that my talents were being overlooked without directly challenging Richard and Patricia's authority. It wasn't until Eleanor's death 2 years later that I understood she had been laying groundwork for something much more significant than family therapy. The reading of Eleanor's will had been a formal affair at the offices of Morrison and Associates, with the entire family gathered to learn how her substantial estate would be distributed. Everyone expected the bulk of her assets to be divided between her son Richard and her 2 grandchildren, with perhaps some charitable bequests to the cultural institutions she had supported. Instead, Eleanor had left everything to me: the penthouse apartment, the art collection, the stock portfolio, the real estate investments, and most importantly, the 30% stake in Sterling Enterprises that she had quietly accumulated over decades of strategic stock purchases. "I don't understand," Patricia had said, staring at the legal documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "Eleanor, why would she leave everything to Mary instead of— Marcus is the heir to the family business." The lawyer had handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Eleanor's careful script. Inside was a letter that explained everything. "My dear Mary, by the time you read this, you will have inherited the financial resources to claim your rightful place in the Sterling family legacy. Use them wisely, and remember what I taught you about patience and careful observation. The company needs someone who understands its real value, not just its surface appeal. I trust you to do what's necessary when the time is right." I was 26 years old, and suddenly worth more than Marcus would ever inherit. The invisible granddaughter had become the secret power behind the Sterling empire. Eleanor's inheritance had transformed me from the family's unpaid assistant into a phantom player in the regional investment community, but I had learned from watching Marcus that power without preparation was just performance. Instead of immediately revealing my new financial status, I had spent 2 years systematically educating myself about corporate finance, securities law, and strategic acquisitions, while maintaining the fiction that I was still the simple, helpful daughter who lived in the basement and served drinks at family events. The education had been intensive and deliberately invisible. While my family assumed I was taking community college courses to improve myself in modest, appropriate ways, I was actually enrolled in an executive MBA program at the State University, attending night classes and weekend intensives that taught sophisticated business strategy to working professionals who couldn't afford to quit their jobs for traditional graduate school. "Mary's taking some business classes," Patricia would tell her friends when they asked what I was doing with my life, her tone suggesting that my academic pursuits were a harmless hobby rather than serious professional development. "It's good for her to have interests outside the house." The MBA program had been demanding but revelatory, introducing me to frameworks for understanding market dynamics, competitive analysis, and organizational leadership that gave me vocabulary for concepts I had been observing intuitively for years. More importantly, it had connected me with a network of sophisticated professionals who saw me as Mary Sterling, the graduate student, rather than Mary Sterling, the overlooked family member. My thesis project had focused on family business succession planning, examining case studies of multi-generational companies that had succeeded or failed in transferring leadership from founders to their children. The research had been personally motivated but academically rigorous, analyzing dozens of family enterprises to identify patterns that predicted successful transitions versus those that ended in bankruptcy or sale to outside investors. The conclusions had been sobering. Family businesses succeeded when leadership was determined by competence rather than birthright, when multiple family members were developed as potential successors, and when ownership and management were separated to prevent family dynamics from compromising business decisions. They failed when parents chose favorites, instead of evaluating capabilities objectively, when succession planning became a popularity contest rather than a merit-based process. "You've written a devastating critique of traditional family business practices," my thesis advisor had observed after reviewing my final draft. "This could be published in business journals. Have you considered pursuing a doctoral degree or going into management consulting?" I had deflected the suggestion with the same self-deprecating humility that had protected me throughout childhood, claiming that my research was just intellectual curiosity rather than professional ambition. But privately, I had been developing a strategic plan for applying my academic insights to the real-world challenge of Sterling Enterprises' future. Eleanor's financial inheritance had made implementation possible. Her stock portfolio was worth $2.8 million. Her real estate investments generated monthly income of $15,000, and her 30% stake in Sterling Enterprises was valued at approximately $45 million based on the company's most recent appraisal. Combined, I controlled assets worth more than $50 million, enough capital to fund whatever strategic initiatives I chose to pursue. The first initiative had been expanding my ownership stake in Sterling Enterprises. Using investment vehicles that obscured my identity as the purchaser, I had systematically acquired additional shares from small investors, retired employees, and former board members who were looking to diversify their portfolios. Each transaction had been structured to comply with securities regulations, while avoiding disclosure requirements that would alert my family to what I was doing. Sterling Enterprises stock has been attracting interest from private investors, Richard had mentioned during one of our rare family business discussions. never suspecting that the mysterious demand was coming from his own daughter. Several institutional buyers have been making inquiries about significant equity positions. Miten, within 18 months, I had increased my ownership from Eleanor's original 30% to 51%, giving me majority control of the company that Marcus expected to inherit. The acquisition had been expensive, requiring most of Eleanor's liquid assets plus leveraged financing secured against her real estate holdings, but it had been strategically essential. Controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises was worth far more than the sum I had paid to acquire it. The second initiative had been building relationships with the business leaders who would eventually need to accept my transition from invisible family member to corporate executive. Using my MBA program networking opportunities and Eleanor's extensive social connections, I had gradually introduced myself to the regional business community as an independent investor with expertise in family business restructuring. Mary Sterling seems to have inherited her grandmother's gift for strategic thinking. I had overheard Chairman Hayes telling another board member during a charity fundraiser where I was serving as Eleanor's estate representative. Her analysis of market consolidation trends in the luxury goods sector was more insightful than most professional consulting reports I've read. The compliment had been thrilling, but also strategic. Hayes was positioning me in his mind as someone whose business opinions deserved serious consideration rather than polite dismissal. When the appropriate time came to reveal my majority ownership, he would remember me as a competent analyst rather than just Richard Sterling's helpful daughter. Now standing in the Sterling Grand Ballroom with crystal fragments at my feet and 300 powerful people staring at me in shock, I realized that the appropriate time had finally arrived. The invisible heiress was about to become very visible indeed. Chairman Hayes's announcement hung in the crystal-clear air of the ballroom like smoke from an explosion, each word reverberating through the stunned silence that had replaced the elegant murmur of high society conversation. 300 of the region's most powerful business leaders stood frozen in tableau, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, conversations abandoned mid-sentence as they tried to process what they had just heard. "Majority shareholder?" Marcus repeated, his voice cracking slightly as he stared at me across the marble floor where I still stood surrounded by shattered crystal. His perfectly composed facade was beginning to crack along with the stemware, revealing something underneath that looked almost like panic. "That's impossible. Mary doesn't own any stock in Sterling Enterprises." Hayes smiled with the patient authority of someone accustomed to delivering information that restructured people's understanding of reality. "Actually, Marcus, your sister owns 51% of the company. She's been the controlling shareholder for nearly 6 months, though she's chosen to remain discreet about her position." Patricia's face had gone white beneath her expertly applied makeup, her usual social poise replaced by the kind of raw shock that comes from discovering that your most basic assumptions about reality are fundamentally wrong. "Mary," she whispered, her voice barely audible across the ballroom. "Is this true?" I straightened slowly, glass fragments crunching under my sensible black flats, as I moved away from the catering station toward the center of the room where my family stood. The crowd parted to create a pathway, their expressions shifting from confusion to fascination as they began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The complete reversal of a family power structure in real time. "It's true," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect ballroom that had been designed to showcase Sterling family events. "I inherited 30% of the company from grandmother Eleanor, and I've acquired additional shares over the past 2 years. As of last month, I control majority ownership." Richard's business instincts were apparently the first to recover from the shock. "Mary, sweetheart, this is wonderful news for the family, of course. We should discuss this privately, figure out how to integrate your new position into our existing succession plans for Marcus." The attempt to maintain family unity and management control was transparent, but desperate. Richard was trying to process the reality that his carefully crafted succession plan had been demolished by the daughter he had been treating as hired help, while simultaneously trying to preserve some semblance of authority over a company he no longer controlled. "Actually, Richard," Hayes interjected, his voice carrying the kind of diplomatic authority that comes from mediating high-stakes business negotiations, "I think the broader business community has a legitimate interest in understanding how this ownership transition will affect Sterling Enterprises' strategic direction." He gestured to the assembled crowd of investors, clients, and industry leaders who were listening with the focused attention usually reserved for earnings reports or merger announcements. This wasn't just a family drama. It was a major business story that would affect stock prices, partnership agreements, and market positioning for one of the region's most significant companies. "Mary," Hayes continued, turning to address me directly with the respect accorded to someone who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, "would you like to share your vision for Sterling Enterprises' future direction?" The question transformed me from family member to business executive in front of 300 witnesses. I felt something shift inside my chest, years of invisible preparation finally crystallizing into the kind of public authority I had never been allowed to claim. "Sterling Enterprises has tremendous potential that hasn't been fully realized," I said, my voice growing stronger as I found my footing in this new role. "The luxury goods market is evolving rapidly, and our company needs leadership that understands both traditional quality standards and emerging consumer preferences." Marcus stepped forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that had served him well in Harvard Business School, but which now seemed desperate, rather than commanding. "Mary, with all due respect, you don't have the experience or training to understand strategic market positioning at this level. This company needs leadership that can navigate complex international partnerships and sophisticated financial structures." "You're absolutely right that this company needs sophisticated leadership," I replied, looking directly at my twin brother, for perhaps the first time in years, as an equal, rather than as his invisible support system. "That's why I've spent the past 2 years earning an MBA in corporate strategy while learning every aspect of our operations from the ground up." The admission drew audible gasps from several board members who were present, their expressions shifting from skepticism to dawning recognition that the quiet family member they had been ignoring might actually be more qualified than the heir apparent they had been supporting. "MBA?" Patricia asked, her voice hollow with the realization that she had completely misunderstood what her daughter had been doing with her life. "Mary, you never said you were pursuing graduate education." "You never asked," I replied simply. "You assumed I was taking community college courses to improve my administrative skills. I didn't correct your assumption because I needed time to prepare for this moment." Chairman Hayes was smiling now with what looked like genuine admiration. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the captivated ballroom, "I believe we're witnessing the beginning of a new era for Sterling Enterprises." The servant daughter had just been revealed as the company owner. The real question was what I planned to do with the power I had been secretly accumulating for 2 years. The private conference room at the Sterling Grand Hotel felt like a courtroom where 28 years of family dynamics were finally being subjected to cross-examination. My parents and Marcus sat across from me at the polished mahogany table, their faces still showing the shock of discovering that their most basic assumptions about our family hierarchy had been completely wrong. Patricia's hands shook slightly as she poured herself coffee from the sterling silver service that had been provided for our emergency family meeting, her usual social grace compromised by the magnitude of what she was trying to process. "Mary, I need you to explain how this happened. How did you acquire majority ownership of our family's company without any of us knowing? The same way you managed to spend 28 years not knowing that I was capable of strategic thinking," I replied, noting how the parallel made her wince. "You weren't paying attention to what I was actually doing because it didn't fit your preconceptions about who I was supposed to be." Richard leaned forward with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for business negotiations, his CEO instincts apparently recognizing that this conversation would determine the future of everything he had built over 3 decades. "Mary, sweetheart, we need to understand your intentions. Sterling Enterprises isn't just a business. It's our family legacy, our contribution to the community, the foundation that supports dozens of other families through employment." The appeal to family loyalty and social responsibility was carefully calculated, designed to make me feel guilty about disrupting the existing order. But after years of being treated as an unpaid servant, whose contributions to that family legacy were invisible, I was immune to manipulation based on collective benefit. "You're absolutely right that Sterling Enterprises supports dozens of families," I said. "That's exactly why the company needs leadership based on competence rather than birth order, strategy rather than charm, and long-term thinking rather than short-term performance that looks good in quarterly reports." Marcus had been uncharacteristically quiet, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked like genuine confusion. "Mary, I don't understand why you did this in secret. If you were interested in playing a larger role in the company, you could have talked to us. We could have found ways to incorporate your interests into our existing structure." The word interests revealed everything about how Marcus conceptualized my capabilities, as hobbies that might be accommodated within the framework of his inevitable leadership, rather than as qualifications that might actually surpass his own. "What existing structure would that be, Marcus?" I asked. "The structure where you attend Harvard Business School while I pack your suitcase? The structure where you give presentations to the board while I process the invoices that keep the company operational? The structure where you get credit for strategic initiatives while I do the research that makes them possible?" The accusations hung in the air like evidence in a criminal trial, each one forcing my family to confront their own complicity in a system that had consistently devalued my contributions while overvaluing Marcus's performance. "We never asked you to be our assistant," Patricia protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "You chose to help with household management and family coordination. We thought you enjoyed that kind of work." "I chose to help because helping was the only way to earn any recognition at all in this family," I said. "I learned early that my value was measured by my usefulness rather than my potential, so I made myself useful while secretly developing the potential you refused to see." The truth was more devastating than anger would have been, because it couldn't be dismissed as emotional overreaction or sibling rivalry. This was a calm, analytical assessment of family dynamics that had been invisible to everyone, except the person who had suffered under them. Marcus finally found his voice, though it emerged smaller than his usual commanding tone. "Mary, even if we made mistakes in how we supported your development, that doesn't mean you're qualified to run Sterling Enterprises. This company requires experience with executive leadership, board management, investor relations, strategic partnerships, all of which I've been learning while you assumed I was just keeping track of your dry cleaning schedule," I interrupted. "Marcus, you've been preparing to inherit this company your entire life. I've been preparing to earn it." Richard's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching fear as he began to understand that this wasn't a temporary family crisis that could be managed through negotiation. This was a complete transfer of power from parents who had controlled their children's lives to a daughter who no longer needed their approval or support. "What do you want from us?" he asked quietly. "What are your terms for working together as a family?" It was the first time in my life that Richard had asked what I wanted, rather than telling me what I should be grateful to receive. The power dynamic that had shaped our entire relationship had been permanently reversed. "I want Marcus to prove that he's qualified for whatever role he claims to deserve," I said. "I want you and Mom to acknowledge that your assumptions about my capabilities were wrong and commit to treating me as an equal family member rather than as unpaid domestic help. And I want all of us to start building relationships based on honesty rather than performance." Patricia was crying now, tears smudging her perfect makeup as she confronted the realization that she had systematically failed one of her children while believing she was being a good mother. "Mary, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We didn't know. We didn't understand." "You didn't want to know," I corrected gently. "There's a difference, but it's not too late to start paying attention to who I actually am, instead of who you needed me to be." The family reckoning was just beginning. Marcus spent the 3 days following the charity gala revelation in what I could only describe as a strategic meltdown, frantically reviewing company documents and financial reports, as if he could somehow discover evidence that my majority ownership was a mistake or hallucination. I found him in his corner office at Sterling Enterprises at 10 o'clock on Thursday night, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and wearing the kind of disheveled desperation that comes from realizing your entire life story requires fundamental revision. "Mary," he said without looking up from the quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk, "I've been analyzing the numbers, and I think there might be some irregularities in how these stock purchases were structured. Some of the shell companies that sold you shares appear to have connections to Grandmother Eleanor's estate, which could create legal complications if the transactions weren't properly disclosed. The attempt to find technical violations in my acquisition strategy was predictable but futile. I had spent months working with securities attorneys to ensure that every purchase complied with applicable regulations, specifically because I knew that Marcus would eventually try to challenge my ownership through legal technicalities. "Marcus, the transactions were reviewed by Morrison and Associates before implementation," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I had sat for years while he explained why his latest strategic initiative required my administrative support. "If you want to waste money on lawyers trying to find problems that don't exist, that's your choice, but it won't change the fundamental reality of the situation." He finally looked up at me, his eyes showing the kind of exhausted confusion that comes from having your worldview collapse overnight. "I don't understand how you did this, Mary. The planning, the financing, the legal coordination. This required sophisticated business knowledge and strategic thinking that you've never demonstrated before. I've never been given the opportunity to demonstrate it before, I corrected. There's a difference between lacking capabilities and lacking permission to display them. The distinction seemed to physically pain him, forcing Marcus to confront the possibility that his success had been built on family favoritism rather than superior ability. For someone whose identity was constructed around being the naturally gifted twin, the suggestion that his sister might actually be more qualified was existentially threatening. "But your academic background," he protested, grasping for evidence that would support his preferred version of reality. "Community college, basic business administration, no advanced training in corporate strategy or financial analysis. How could you possibly have developed the expertise to execute a hostile takeover? Executive MBA from the State University, concentration in family business succession and corporate finance, thesis on strategic planning for multi-generational enterprises," I replied calmly. "Also 3 years of continuing education in securities law and 2 years of practical experience managing investment portfolios worth more than $50 million. Each credential I listed seemed to diminish Marcus further, his carefully maintained professional confidence evaporating as he was forced to accept that his overlooked sister had been building qualifications that surpassed his own Harvard education. "That's impossible," he said weakly. "I would have known if you were pursuing graduate education. Mom and Dad would have mentioned it, would have celebrated your achievements the way they celebrated mine." The statement revealed the depth of Marcus's unconscious privilege, his assumption that any family member's significant accomplishment would naturally become a topic of household celebration, because that had been his universal experience. He literally couldn't conceive of achievement that went unrecognized, because his achievements had always been the center of family attention. "They didn't know because they never asked what I was actually studying," I explained. "They assumed I was taking remedial courses to improve my secretarial skills, and I didn't correct their assumption because I needed time to prepare without interference or premature expectations." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of what I was telling him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect mixed with bewilderment. "Mary, if you had these capabilities all along, why didn't you compete with me for recognition? Why did you let me believe I was the only one in the family with business potential?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, rather than defensive anger, suggesting that Marcus was finally beginning to understand that our family dynamics had been more complex than he had realized. "Because competing with you meant risking the only form of love I received," I said. "As long as I stayed in my assigned role as the helpful sister, I had a place in the family. If I had tried to challenge your position as the golden child, I might have lost even that small amount of belonging." The admission seemed to devastate Marcus more than any criticism of his abilities. He was confronting the realization that his sister had sacrificed her own development to preserve family harmony, while he had benefited from that sacrifice without even recognizing it was happening. "God, Mary," he whispered, his professional composure finally cracking completely. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I never thought about what it cost you to always support my success." "I know you didn't think about it," I said gently. "That was part of the problem, but it was also part of what made the strategy possible. You couldn't defend against a threat you couldn't imagine." The golden twin was learning what it felt like to be seen clearly for the first time in his life. The first official board meeting under my majority ownership felt like stepping onto a stage where I had been rehearsing in secret for years, finally able to deliver lines I had been memorizing while everyone assumed I was just learning to serve refreshments properly. 8 directors sat around the conference table at Sterling Enterprises headquarters, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism, as they tried to adjust to the reality that the woman they had barely noticed was now the person who controlled their company's future. "Mary," said Board Chairman William Hayes, opening the meeting with the kind of diplomatic formality that suggested he was still calibrating how to address someone whose status had changed so dramatically. "We appreciate you calling this meeting to discuss your vision for Sterling Enterprises' strategic direction." The phrase, "your vision," carried weight that I had never been allowed to claim before. For the first time in my life, powerful business leaders were asking for my opinion, because my opinion would determine policy, rather than because they were being polite to Richard Sterling's helpful daughter. "Thank you, William," I replied, noting how using his first name subtly established my position as a peer rather than a subordinate. I've prepared a comprehensive analysis of our company's current market position and recommendations for strategic initiatives that will strengthen our competitive advantages while addressing operational inefficiencies. I distributed copies of the presentation I had been developing for 2 years, watching the board members' faces as they examined analysis that was more sophisticated than anything they had seen from previous management reports. These were not superficial observations or borrowed strategies from Harvard case studies. This was detailed, data-driven assessment of Sterling Enterprises' actual performance metrics and market opportunities. "Mary, this is remarkably thorough," said board member Patricia Williams, reading through my financial projections with obvious surprise. "Your analysis of luxury goods market segmentation identifies trends that our current strategic planning process has completely missed." The compliment was significant because Patricia had been one of Marcus's strongest supporters on the board, convinced that his Harvard credentials and Wall Street experience made him uniquely qualified for executive leadership. Her recognition of my analytical capabilities represented a major shift in how board members were beginning to perceive the ownership transition. "Thank you, Patricia," I said. "I believe our company's challenges require solutions based on comprehensive understanding of our operations rather than theoretical frameworks that may not apply to our specific market position." The criticism of theoretical frameworks was directed at Marcus, who sat at the far end of the table, looking like someone attending a memorial service for his own career. His strategic initiatives had been based largely on business school case studies and consulting firm recommendations, rather than intimate knowledge of how Sterling Enterprises actually functioned as an operational entity. "What are your intentions regarding current executive leadership?" asked board member David Chen, cutting directly to the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to ask explicitly. "Marcus will continue as Director of Strategic Development," I announced, watching my brother's face carefully as I defined his new role. "His Harvard training and networking capabilities are valuable assets that should be utilized appropriately. However, I will be assuming the position of Chief Executive Officer, with operational authority for all major business decisions." The demotion was delivered professionally, but unambiguously. Marcus was being reduced from heir apparent to department head, his authority limited to advisory functions rather than executive control. After a lifetime of being groomed to inherit the company, he was learning what it felt like to be the sibling whose role was supporting someone else's leadership. "Mary," said Richard, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, "the CEO position requires extensive experience with board relations, investor communications, and regulatory compliance. Are you prepared to handle those responsibilities?" The question was asked with paternal concern, but also contained an implicit challenge. My father was suggesting that I might be overreaching by claiming authority I wasn't qualified to exercise. "I've been preparing for those responsibilities for 2 years," I replied calmly. "I've completed executive education programs in corporate governance and securities law, developed relationships with key investors through Grandmother Eleanor's network, and worked with legal counsel to ensure compliance with all applicable regulations regarding ownership disclosure and fiduciary responsibilities." Each qualification I listed seemed to surprise the board members more, forcing them to recognize that my transition to CEO wasn't an impulsive power grab, but the culmination of systematic preparation for executive leadership. "What about international expansion?" Marcus asked, his voice smaller than his usual commanding tone. "The European partnerships I've been developing require sophisticated understanding of cross-border regulatory frameworks and currency hedging strategies." "The European partnerships you've been developing are actually modifications of agreements that other luxury goods companies established 5 years ago," I said, pulling out documentation that I had prepared for exactly this challenge. "Your strategic plan borrowed their framework without adapting it to our company's specific operational requirements or financial constraints. The evidence was devastating because it was accurate." Marcus's celebrated international expansion initiative was revealed as competent but unoriginal thinking, impressive in presentation, but lacking in genuine innovation. William Hayes was smiling now with what looked like genuine appreciation for the corporate drama unfolding before him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe we're witnessing a masterclass in strategic succession planning." The power had officially changed hands. Now came the harder task, proving I could wield it effectively. 18 months after the charity gala revelation that changed everything, I sat in my CEO office, the corner suite that Marcus had been expecting to inherit, reviewing quarterly reports that told the story of Sterling Enterprises' transformation under new leadership. The company that had been struggling with declining profit margins and risky expansion strategies was now generating record revenues through careful market positioning and operational efficiency improvements. The financial numbers were impressive, but they told only part of the story. More significant was the cultural shift that had occurred throughout the organization as employees adjusted to leadership that valued analytical thinking and collaborative problem-solving over charismatic presentation and hierarchical authority. "The staff seems to respond well to your management style," said Jennifer Walsh, my executive consultant who had helped guide the company's strategic restructuring. "Employee satisfaction surveys show significant improvements in job security confidence and workplace communication quality. The improvement in employee morale hadn't been accidental. Unlike Marcus, whose leadership style was based on inspiring followers through personal charisma and top-down decision-making, I had focused on creating systems that allowed talented people throughout the organization to contribute their insights to strategic planning processes. When you've been overlooked yourself, you develop sensitivity to recognizing overlooked talent in others," I explained, reviewing promotion recommendations for several employees whose capabilities had been underutilized under previous management. "Some of our best operational innovations have come from suggestions by people who actually perform the work, rather than from executives who theorize about it." The promotion of previously overlooked employees had created a ripple effect throughout Sterling Enterprises, establishing a culture where contributions were evaluated based on merit rather than on position in formal hierarchies. The result was a more dynamic and responsive organization that adapted quickly to changing market conditions. Marcus had surprised everyone, including himself, by thriving in his new role as Director of Strategic Development. Freed from the pressure of living up to impossible expectations as the designated heir, he had discovered genuine aptitude for collaborative planning and stakeholder relationship management. "I think I'm actually better at this than I was at pretending to be CEO material," he had admitted during one of our monthly strategy meetings. "I was so focused on projecting leadership authority that I never learned how to actually lead people effectively." The admission had marked a turning point in our relationship, shifting from competitive siblings to collaborative professionals who recognized that their different strengths could complement each other, rather than cancel each other out. My parents had struggled more with the adjustment, particularly Patricia, whose identity as the mother of the golden child had been fundamental to her social standing in our community. Learning that she had systematically undervalued one daughter while overinvesting in the other had triggered a crisis of maternal confidence that was still ongoing. "I keep thinking about all the times I dismissed your achievements or redirected your interest toward more appropriate activities," she had told me during one of our awkward but increasingly honest conversations. "I was so convinced that I understood your limitations that I never bothered to discover your actual capabilities. The important thing is that you're willing to see me differently now," I had replied. "We can't change the past, but we can build better relationships going forward." Richard had adapted more successfully, his business instincts allowing him to appreciate the strategic thinking that had made my hostile takeover possible, even if his paternal emotions struggled with being outmaneuvered by his daughter. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," he had said after reviewing our latest quarterly performance reports. "I may not understand how I failed to recognize your potential, but I can certainly recognize the results you're producing now." The recognition felt good, but it was no longer essential to my sense of self-worth. Years of invisible preparation had taught me to validate my own capabilities, rather than depending on others' approval for confidence in my decisions. The regional business community had initially been skeptical of my transition from administrative assistant to CEO, but 18 months of improved company performance had converted skeptics into admirers. "Mary Sterling represents a new model of family business succession," William Hayes had told a reporter for the Business Journal's feature story about Sterling Enterprises' transformation. "She proves that the most qualified family member isn't always the most obvious choice for leadership." The article had generated speaking invitations from business schools and family enterprise institutes, opportunities to share insights about strategic succession planning with other families facing similar challenges. Looking out my office window at the city where I had spent 28 years being invisible, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by the decision to stop accepting other people's definitions of my worth and start building the life I actually wanted. The servant daughter had become the CEO, but more importantly, the invisible person had learned to see herself clearly. That transformation was worth more than all the corporate power and financial success combined. The Sterling dynasty would continue, but under new management and with new values that recognized all kinds of excellence rather than just the kinds that demanded attention. I had finally come home to myself.